Welcome and thank you for joining us for our Workday Chats today. I'm Traci Schmitz and I am so excited to be your host and moderator for what I know will be an energized, inspired, real, and relatable discussion around what it means to nurture a culture of belonging. From personal stories to what the research and data are telling us, from allyship in action to catalyzing cultural confidence and trust, we are going to dig in. But first, to our listeners, if you have any questions whatsoever, please share them in the comments below. Today, I'm joined by some phenomenal folks who know without question that nurturing a culture of belonging is industry agnostic. They recognize that as leaders, as people really, we are often navigating some trying times. And so it is increasingly important that not only do we pay attention, but we act with intention to cultivate climates where employees, regardless of level, role, or sector, feel they belong. Because amongst other things, a sense of belonging is a feeling. So without further ado, today I'm joined by Blair Taylor, Managing Director, Talent and Organization and North America Lead, Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity at Accenture. I'm also joined by my colleague, Rogerio Almeida, Vice President of Global Field Alliances at Workday. And last but certainly not least, my colleague, Lauryn Bissell, Senior Business Psychologist at Workday. Welcome to all of you. So let's get started by sharing what belonging means to each of you. And if you would be so kind as to share your vision for a workplace that actively promotes belonging. If you'd like, feel free to elaborate on some of the benefits we might see in a culture where belonging is centered. So nothing like starting with a three-parter. And Rogerio, I'd love for you to kick us off.
Oh, that's great. Hi, Tracy. Hello, my colleagues in the panel as well. So it's great to be here. Just a brief introduction. I'm Brazilian. So I live in London. I'm a gay man. I've been with my partner for the last 17 years, and I love working here at Workday. And this is something that is really, really close to my heart. So I think that belonging to me is really the safety to be yourself, 100%. And there is a just juxtaposition between the person that you are at work and your friends socially and the person that you are at work. So those two things for me and those two behaviors, they merge into one. I also think that there is, you have to create a culture, of engagement for the employees, for a person to feel that they belong in the organization that they're part of. But there should be really a deeper sense of partnership and camaraderie and, dare I say, friendship between the fellow employees of an organization. I think that the more connected the people feel to the people that they work with, the more they feel that they belong into a particular organization. Of course, from an organizational perspective, this clearly results in organizational performance. The more the people feel that they belong, the better the organizations perform. The better the organizations perform and people feel good about what they do and they feel a sense of accomplishment, of course, the sense of belonging is there. Perhaps I would just say one thing as well, Tracy, the feeling of not belonging. And from a personal experience, many years ago, unfortunately, I had a partner who committed suicide, and I wasn't out at work, and I didn't feel that I could have the space and the environment around myself to be myself, and I ended up, feeling very, very alone and lonely at one point in my career. And in those days, they didn't really talk about mental health issues, and it wasn't as much out there as it is now. So I ended up leaving the organization I was with before, and not because of them, but because of the way that I felt about it. So I think that there is a lot to be discussed around sense of belonging and making sure that you truly create, as a leader, an environment where your team can feel included. But if you're not a manager, you also have a responsibility, to create the space for everybody to feel that you are one of those people that are encouraging them to be themselves. So that's in a nutshell for me, Tracy.
Yeah, that's thank you, first of all, for sharing, such deep personal experiences. I know we all appreciate that. And I completely agree. Belonging is really a two-way street, right? And you talk about safe space. I mean, it's important for leaders to understand what they can do, but it's all of our responsibility to co-create and continue to nurture and cultivate an environment that is brave and safe. So thank you for that. So much to unpack. Again, it's a three-parter. Blair, I'd love to go to you next, but before you chime in, I've had an opportunity to chat with you. I know you have a perspective on what belonging means to you, but you've also remarked on what it doesn't mean. You have said that belonging doesn't mean fitting in, and that resonated so deeply with me. I feel it's super important for other people to hear because, as I mentioned, it invites us not only to think about how we all have a responsibility in creating a safe space, but also a brave space where we can be ourselves, where we don't feel a need to conform, and where we can perhaps expand upon and even celebrate the diversity, right, in the space. So I would love for you to unpack this a little bit more for us.
Well, first of all, Tracy, thank you so much for having me today. This is such an important conversation that we're having. And really resonate with what Rogerio said. Listen, I do think that many people conflate this notion of kind of acceptance with the notion of belonging. And certainly acceptance is a component of belonging. But in acceptance is a little bit different. We have to distinguish that from belonging because acceptance often has the connotation or the expectation that you will become more like me, or you will become more like the prevalent group in an organization. And it also has the connotation that I will accept you if you assimilate, right, to become more like somebody else. And interestingly enough, with respect to the power of diversity, equity, inclusion, which is what we're all trying to tap into and unlock, right? That's what we want to get at. That's the golden nugget here. That form of acceptance where I accept you when you become more like me, I accept you when you assimilate, I accept you only when you fit in, that actually dilutes the full power of diversity. Belonging in the context that we're talking about it here, and the context of unlocking the power of belonging, is really, I welcome you, I respect you for who you are. And I want you to bring your whole self to work. I want your diversity of opinion. I want the diversity of your background. I want to know that perspective and orientation, even if it's very, very different from my own. I've always gone out of my way to try to build teams that are incredibly diverse. If I look around the table and I see a bunch of people who either look like me, think like me, or act like me, or have a background that's similar to mine, I go, wait a second, I'm not doing what I need to do as a leader. I want those different backgrounds and perspectives because at the end of the day, it's going to enable us to build a better mousetrap. The statistics on this are quite clear. For for-profit companies, for example, building those companies that build a highly inclusive culture, right, which is a culture about belonging, recognizing differences, enabling people to bring their whole selves to work, have 2.3 times the cash flow per employee of those who do not. So there's real business implications for this. And a culture in belonging is something that we all want to strive for creating because it ultimately unlocks the power of diversity. And by the way, I've seen the other end of the spectrum as well, where a person of color, whether they're African-American or Asian-American or Latino, tries to abandon who they are, right? And interestingly enough, many organizations are actually expecting me to bring the African-American perspective, my background as an African-American to the workplace. If I abandon that or try to mitigate or subdue that, I may not be seen as bringing the full value and perspective that I could bring to an organization. I've seen that happen with executives too, who are denying their ethnicity or denying who they are. And when the organization asks you for a perspective, for example, you may not be connected enough to that population to be able to offer that valuable perspective in that moment. So I think this is something that organizations are beginning to recognize the value of. Those that are reaping the benefits. And as individuals, we need to recognize there's value in who I am. There's value in my background. There's value in my culture and what I bring. And so recognizing those things, unlocking that power, I think is what belonging is all about.
That was incredible. Snaps and claps, if I may say so myself. I mean, I told you all this is going to be some truth telling today. And these are the kinds of conversations that we have to have, right? We cannot shy away from them. So again, thank you, Blair, for offering your perspective. Lauryn, I'm coming over to you. Again, it's the same question, but now through a psychology lens. And I must share with you that for quite some time, I've been interested in learning about this tension, right, that exists between our innate desire to be part of a group, to feel like we belong, and to what both Rogerio and Blair have commented on, and that is wanting to also be our authentic self. So I think it's super intriguing, and I would love for you to tell us more.
Yeah, I think this is such an important point that we don't talk about often is our social identity does face that fundamental tension that you're mentioning between those competing social needs. So I need to be a part of a group, but not just be a part of a group. I need to be able to bring my individuality, my authenticness, myself into that group and be accepted. Without those two pieces, you don't have belonging. And I think what is so important to talk about in this space is that belonging is not just important, it's a fundamental human need that we have. So this has been a part of our human nature for all of its existence. So in order to survive, we had to form groups and be successful and belong in groups. So this has been part of our nature forever. And as we look at how our brain interacts today with the idea of belonging, when we feel like we are accepted and have good social standing and belong in a group, our brain stimulates our pleasure section of our brain. So we feel pleasure in that. The opposite, though, when we feel excluded, when we feel isolated, when we feel like we don't belong as our authentic self in a group, our brain actually lights up the same area as when we feel physical pain. And so that is critical. When you think about that kind of reaction that we just have innately, that translates into organizational performance, of course, but this is just translating into how we can be as a human, right? So increased loneliness, increased depression, increased anxiety, all comes with that physical pain feeling around this psychological state that we become in. And this impacts our organizational performance. We've actually seen interesting research that if someone feels like they're excluded right before going in to take an IQ test, it actually lowers their IQ score on that test. So we have a very strong reaction to this feeling of exclusion. And healthy work teams are teams that encourage that individual expression, and then that creates an identity of both belonging and uniqueness together. And so that's the real goal, and I think the real pieces we have to talk about. This is critical to who we are and core to us as humans.
Wow.
Tracy, can I just say something on, sort of, something that
Absolutely.
Blair mentioned that piqued my interest. I came out about 30 years ago. 25 years ago now. And I clearly remember when I was, in my initial part of my career, that I wanted to conform. And by conforming meant I need to be straight and I need to have a girlfriend or a wife and I need to have some kids. And I was deeply unhappy by lying, by not being myself, by sort of ignoring part of who I was in that social context, which was the professional context, which you spend, 8 to 10 hours a day at work, right? And of course, life went by, and when I talked about, my past story of, loss, when that happened, that for me was a catalyst. I thought that point, I can't carry on having two separate lives and being two different people. And if you're going to like me and if you're going to hang out with me, it is because of the person that I am and who I am. And if you don't like it, it's not my problem, it's yours. And it's really funny. I left then an organization and I joined another one. And from that day, I made up my mind to be my 100% self. The irony is that all of those horrible feelings of I'm not going to be welcome, and I'm not going to be loved, and I'm not going to be appreciated, and I'm not going to be observed and respected, all of that went away from day one. All of that. And that permission that gave me of speaking my mind, making my point, making my observations, allowing myself to be a whole person in the room with whoever else was around me. And I'll tell you, that feeling of freedom and that feeling of authenticity is so very empowering. And if there's somebody hearing this conversation here, there is, we've all got our own demons, we've all got our secrets, we've all got our, the things that make that who we are. But a lot of the times, the walls are created by ourselves as well. Right. And I was the one that created it. Of course, I am now in an environment, in an organization that is deeply welcoming and deeply accepting and deeply encouraging of me as a human. And the way that I pay back is by doing things like this and being even more of a voice to be able to say there is another way. But organizations have a deep responsibility. And leaders in organizations have a deep responsibility to create the environment where people like me can thrive. And oh my goodness, I've been so very lucky, and I've had wonderful experiences professionally that have, resulted in amazing friendships and relationships that I hold very dear to my heart. So sorry, I can speak for hours on this. I'll shut up. And but it is something that is very, very important.
No, it so very much is. And thank you for chiming in with that. I mean, really, at the end of the day, yes, we're all human. We all have innate need and desire, and we owe it to ourselves. I could feel that, right? In your journey, sort of when you were able to just say, I'm going to be who I am and you can accept me or not, right? That was empowering. And it just, I would imagine it was a big weight off of your shoulders. So I agree with you. I mean, we all have that within us, but sometimes getting there, right? It's a journey. It's a journey. This whole thing is a journey. And so that's actually a perfect segue, because creating a workplace of belonging is just that. It's a journey. And now we're in this hybrid working world. It's more critical than ever to think about how businesses can nurture this sense of belonging, both in the office and remotely. So what I'd love to dig into is, what are some of the key areas in either your organization or the organizations that you've worked with are focusing on? So again, so much we could talk about here, a lot to unpack. Blair, I would love for you to get that unpacking underway for us.
I appreciate the question, Tracy. Let me take it from two levels. Let me try to take it from an individual level, and then let me try to take it from an organizational level. And they are related, but I'll be brief. But let me just say first, from an individual level, getting to the notion of creating a leader who can establish a culture of belonging is harder than we might think. It doesn't necessarily come naturally to everybody. And part of the reason for that is we are actually programmed to accept, surround ourselves with, and look for people who act, think, behave, come from similar backgrounds or experiences as we do. And I think Lauryn would agree with me that when we are come up against differences, it tends to trigger a fear, an instinctive fear in us that something's not comfortable, something's not right, I don't like this. And so therefore we gravitate toward what is comfortable, which is familiarity. Now, I tell leaders all the time, and I will say it here, that we have to deprogram ourselves. We have to intentionally deprogram ourselves. And we do that, and I have an expression that I use often, which is we do that by making ourselves intentionally uncomfortable, putting ourselves in situations where we may be the only one in the room to see what that feels like, right? As one example. And if you're 40 years old in your career and you've never had the feeling of being the only one in the room, let me tell you, you need to experience that, because that is part of what people of color, underrepresented minorities, LGBTQ people who are from that part of the human spectrum, people who are underrepresented minorities go through that every single day, right? Being the only one in the room. And so as leaders, we need to experience that. We need to gain the empathy that comes from that. And that's not easy to do, but it's a necessity, right? As an organization, it's also challenging, right? And an organization's made up of individuals, but if you think about the environment we're in now, particularly with remote work, this is a tough scenario, and we have to figure out ways of staying connected. Maybe most especially to the most vulnerable parts of our population. How do we think about ensuring that we're exchanging ideas, using technology to the best of our ability? I had a CEO early on in the COVID outbreak who said, Blair, I'm communicating with my people once a week. And I said, well, how are you doing that? He said, well, I'm sending out memos and updates. I said, whoa, wait a second. They need to see your face. They need to have an opportunity to ask you questions. They need to have as real a presence as humanly possible, given the limitations that we're under. So we have to figure out ways of staying connected, even through the challenging times that we're having now. Can you utilize things like employee resource groups and activate them in new and creative ways to make sure that you're hearing the voices of those populations who are experiencing things in a very different and poignant way as we go through the post-George Floyd era, as we go through COVID? It is having a disparate impact on people. And how do we ensure that those voices are heard, even with the challenges of remote and Zoom and all the things that we're using now to try to stay connected? How do we leverage those and activate them in a way that allows us to tap into these voices, not just to hear them for the sake of hearing them, but including them in things like business decisions and product development and all the things that are key to driving our business forward, so that those populations not only feel heard, but they feel valued. And that is, for organizations, it's a challenging thing to do, but it's an absolute necessity.
Yes, I hear you on all levels. And, again, what keeps coming up for me is just, this is all human-centered. Again, going back to the innate need to connect. And what I'm hearing as well is we have an opportunity, right? Again, across all sorts of organizations to get more creative in how we are leveraging ERGs, for example. I mean, yes, those folks have the awareness and the understanding, sort of that cultural responsiveness component that they can bring to the table, but also it's an opportunity from a development standpoint, right? From an engagement standpoint, which then lends itself to belonging. So I love all of that. Thank you so much, Blair. Rogerio, I would love to go to you next, please.
Sure. I was thinking as Blair was speaking and giving his opinion, and thinking about Workday and how, what Workday has had, and Workday is probably, like many other organizations, what from day to night, we were thrusted into this virtual world that we now have to have Zooms and, all sorts of video conferencing technologies to bring people together. I've been hiring a lot of people without meeting them. In fact, my wonderful EA was hired without me ever, setting eyes on her, in real life. And I was, oh my goodness, is that going to work? So all of that changed from day to night. What hasn't changed, I think, is the experiences that we need to create with each other. Right? That has not changed. And I keep reminding my leaders that when you're on a Zoom with somebody or a video call with somebody else, be present in that moment. It's very easy during a video conference. I've got two mobiles, I've got one iPad, I've got my Mac, I've got my screen, I've got the telephone here, it's the world of distraction is incredible. It is very easy on a Zoom call, to be looking up here and then down here and then down there. And if I'm being spoken to by somebody that it doesn't really feel that person is observing me as I'm speaking, that's not a great experience. That's one point for me. So I like being monopurpose when I am in conversations with other people, because it's the way that people connect. Because in real life, when you are sitting in front of somebody from a coffee, you're not looking at, or you shouldn't be looking at your mobile, because that's, deeply disrespectful for that person that is opposite you. So for me, that's the first thing. The second thing for me, and it's really, really important, is when you're asking questions face to face or on a Zoom, in my eyes, you have to ask a question to learn, not to ask a question to respond, right? If somebody is giving you their opinion, you're, genuinely inquiring about, what that point of view is. And if you're creating a safe environment, an environment that people feel accommodated and accepted in, the question needs to be asked for you to learn, not for you to just, respond to something that is already predisposition in your head to come up with. I also think that in this world, this hybrid world that we are all moving into now, it seems that way. We in leadership positions, we have to create spaces for people to have voices. Not everybody is gushy like I am, right? And I need to, to make accommodation for those people that are, they will have wonderful ideas, but they sit in a meeting, they're really quiet. And my early day perception was maybe Tracy's not that interested in what I got to say. But maybe Tracy was deeply interested, but she was just shy. And she just really didn't feel that she had the space to communicate what her point of view was. So I think that, that we have to have emotional intelligence enough and sufficiently enough to, one, observe and be observant of the people that we speak to. I think be monopurpose. I can't really observe if you're flinching in something that I'm saying, if I am looking at 1,000 different things on my screen at the time that I'm speaking to you. And I think that, that finally, you don't need to be a manager to be a leader, and you don't need to be a manager to create the environment in the space, remotely or otherwise, for people to have a voice. And this is where allyship, I think, comes up, and many times, I've interrupted, my own boss in previous lives. I said, excuse me, Tracy, Joe here wants to say something, but I don't think that people are picking up on it. Come on, Joe, speak. And I wasn't a manager, and I was just creating the space for that person, and no one should, sort of be angry or upset with me for, speaking up to somebody. But I also need to have the emotional intelligence, I believe, to measure when I should interject, because sometimes Tracy doesn't want to speak in front of 10,000 people. She wants to speak on a one-to-one basis. So those human traits, they're no different whether they are online or the face-to-face. It's just, I think that, common courtesy between people. But what is important is that, our senses during a virtual connection, I think they need to be heightened to be able to, to get the signals that people are giving to you.
Wow, that was amazing, Rogerio. Thank you so much. We could stay on this thing for like 5 hours, honestly. So, but you did inspire me. I just want to share this because, you talked about speaking up for others, right? And that to me was like allyship in action. And there's something that I've read a few times, so I'm just going to read it. So just bear with me. And that is that allyship is a continuous process. So it's not a designation that one can earn and hold forever. It's also not a label that one can give themselves, but you earn it from your actions and your commitment, right? So thank you for your actions and your commitment. Back to the question, when we think about, again, this hybrid world, there's a breadth of opportunity, I think, for us, across many organizations. And the great thing is, based on what you all have just said already, we don't necessarily have to recreate the wheel, but maybe it's reimagining, right? So it's, again, human-centered, but reimagining what a workplace culture looks like in a hybrid world. So with that in mind, Lauryn, I would love you to take us home with this one.
Yeah, and I think that's really one of the largest things organizations are wrestling with right now. A lot of organizations traditionally have thought about culture as an office environment and the perks. And that's, culture is much bigger than that. So culture is really about what we're talking about today. It's about belonging. It's about feeling a part of something bigger. It's about sharing values and aligning to a purpose, and really that, group together heading towards something that really creates culture. And so organizations are having to rethink how to make those connections and create that environment outside of a traditional office setting. And it's a tough thing to think about, and it's an important thing to think about because work forms such a large part of our identity. And so a lot of us have felt, isolated from work over the past couple of years, and that has a negative impact on our well-being. And we talk about kind of this hybrid working environment, but if we go back to what caused it, we're also still living in a pandemic. And so everyone is in this prolonged state of uncertainty that has very big health and well-being implications on us. And we're in this flux back and forth of, I think it's almost over, I'm feeling optimistic, and then we have a variant that comes in, and now I'm in a regression, and it's very exhausting. And it's affecting all of us differently. And I think this is really a topic where individuality comes into play. So for people who are already prone to anxiety, depression, this is really impacting that heavily. It's perpetuating that. And everyone's being impacted different. So for some people, remote working is great. They have other people in their environment, so they're getting that connection. They are thriving in this. They're finding new balance, right? They're going for walks in the middle of the day, and that's great. They want to keep that. For others, they're feeling isolated. And we have to really look at this, I think, at the local level. That's where leaders and teammates play such a critical role of understanding where is my team at, where are they at individually, and what's right for them. I think the theme to take away from what organizations need to think about today is autonomy and choice. For 2 years, we've all felt so out of control, and everyone wants more agency and control over their life. So where we can give them that from an organizational perspective, where we can make those options and give those choices, it's critical. Not every organization can have hybrid working, right? There's many organizations where you have to be on site. It's part of the job. But how can we think about flexibility in that job and more autonomy? So I think that's really critical. So that's kind of, I'm thinking about from a culture standpoint. But I just wanted to go back to Blair, what you said, because I think if there's one big takeaway today, I just love the takeaway of really level setting on this in-group, out-group mentality, this natural tendency we've had all of our life to associate with people who are like us. And so I think if everyone just takes the time to think back, who's in my social circle? Who's in my professional circle? Who is not in that circle? Who is someone not like me? And how do I spend more time intentionally with someone different than me and make new associations? Because I think that is where we start to really change behavior. And that's something every one of us can do today. And it takes reflection and it takes action and creating relationships. But to me, that's really the key of creating this holistic belonging. So I just wanted to circle back on that because I think it was so important what he called out.
Yeah, no, thank you for doing that. And I'm so sorry to have interrupted you. I absolutely agree. And so that's an invitation to us and to, folks tuning in, right? Like, let's challenge ourselves. So I love that. And Lauryn, I'm going to stick with you for this next question. So, you talked about just autonomy and how different people thrive in different spaces. And we know just, again, across industries, people are speaking up, right? There are some new expectations that employees are putting on corporations. I mean, there's employee activism, for example. And so the employee voice and the role of that is increasingly important. So how can organizations leverage employee listening? And you've talked about this a bit, you all have, in fact, but how might we leverage employee listening to identify areas for improvement, take action to build a more equitable, workplace? And then how might we assess progress? Because that's a thing. I think, some people might say, if you can't measure it, then you can't improve it. So I'm going to leave it with that. And I'd love to hear more from you.
Yeah, I think this is such an important space because employees are more vocal than ever. We're actually seeing more and more higher volumes of comments, more and more interaction with surveys. And if you're not giving your employees the space to share their feedback, they're going to share it somewhere. So let's get it internal. Let's figure out as an organization, let's show that support and concern and take action. And the really critical part of that is, are you creating a psychological safe place for people to share their feedback? Do I feel like I can share my voice? Can I be honest in my feedback? Do I know that it will be, absorbed? Everything I say may not take action immediately, or I may not have the right, the right need for the organization at the time, but was my feedback heard? That's just as powerful as if the action is taken sometimes. So giving that safe space is really important. And what the pandemic has highlighted is that traditional survey methods just are not working these days. So what I mean by that is they're not regular or sensitive enough to pick up on all the changing dynamics and all the needs of employees in real time. The world's been rapidly changing. You know, we talked about just a minute ago how individuals are all different. So we need really a system where we're collecting feedback ongoing and taking action. And it needs to become a part of the culture and not this thing that HR is giving me, not an event from HR, right? It has to become a part of the culture, this listening culture. And so when we think about how to measure that, there's different things that are important. We really want to measure the full life cycle of the employee experience. So we want to understand things like employee engagement. And then we want to look at engagement in the lens of the different drivers of engagement. So things like growth, do I understand the strategy? But what's critical is, are we dissecting that and understanding the difference in experience by different demographics? So where are the important stories where a certain demographic in the organization is not having the same experience as everyone else or as another, and how do we take local action? That's critical to belonging. In addition to that lens, we also need a lens to understand how organizations feel they're being supported with diversity, equity, and inclusion in general. So are you asking questions to understand how the actions you're taking are working? Same with health and well-being. How is the organization supporting employees? So there's a lot of important questions to ask, and it's also about that more frequent listening strategy. But are you taking consistent action? Are you telling employees that we heard you? Here's what we heard, and here's what we're planning. Here's what we're doing about it. You have to close that feedback loop for it to be successful.
I could not agree more. Thank you so much. And I have to just interject that I am so appreciative of the holistic nature of this conversation. Each of you is again centering human beings, and as human beings, you know, our emotional well-being, right, is top of mind, and we're talking about that, and we're looking at that, and we're trying again to put programs and other sort of initiatives, tools, resources in place to be supportive. I also think that, you know, people, you know, would appreciate knowing, again, to your point, like, you heard me. That's great. And we may not be able to correct this tomorrow, but you heard me, and you're being transparent about what we're going to do together to address what I've surfaced. So this is wonderful. Rogerio, I know you have an opinion here. Please share it.
Oh my goodness, right. Look, you know, performing organizations are the organizations that hire, you know, high performing individuals, and high performing individuals want to stay if they feel that they belong. And to feel that they belong, I believe, you know, it's the, you know, if you want to know my opinion, let me share my opinion with you. Now, how do you capture that opinion? How do you, you know, collate all of, you know, the collection of opinions that you have across your employee base? And then, just as importantly, what do you do with that information once you have it? So I think that, you know, the organizations that are performing and organizations that want to continue to perform, this change about listening to your employees, it has to start at the top. If the top of the organization is not interested in what, you know, the vast majority of the employee population, I've got to say, I think this is a non-starter. You will have one or two departments where the managers are really great and insightful, but this needs to be an organization-wide process. It can't just be, you know, one or two people sharing information, collaborating, but hey, what about the rest of us? So, and these organizations, I believe, there needs to be a certain level of intellectual curiosity to ask the question, and you've got to be prepared to listen to the answers that you get when you ask the questions that you have, and some of the answers you're not going to like. But what would you rather? Would you rather, you know, to Lauryn's point, that I went onto the web and just, you know, shared my opinion anonymously, or would you like to create a conduit for people to actually? I mean, we give reviews about everything these days. I mean, you go out to your corner shop and you get bad service or you get good service, you will share your opinion somewhere, right? You share with friends. Sometimes you will share on the internet. Sometimes you will share in websites that are, you know, there's a lot of people looking at what, you know, those websites are talking about. So the new wave of professionals that is coming, and myself included, because I share my opinion about everything. And we have to collate that. Now, there needs to be, I believe, an intentionality of the question, and of course an intentionality of the reading the answer that you get. And it's no good us asking questions and not providing to the employee population or to a particular specific employee a follow-up. And what have we done with that suggestion? What have we done with that observation? What have we done with something that somebody came up with a really great idea, and the idea, ended up in the ether and no one acted on it? So I think that the democratization of the information, of the actions that are being taken as a result of that is really, really important. Now, for very large organizations, you have to have some sort of technology system to be able to, to analyze that volume of information and maintain sometimes, the employee privacy. Sometimes I want to share my opinion, but I don't want to say that I don't like you, Tracy, as my boss, because that day you're really rude to me, and et cetera, et cetera. But I want somebody to hear it, and I want this to be captured somewhere. Equally, I may have a really great idea, but I'm not really sure, where to go with my idea and, what do I do with it? So there are, wonderful tools out there of, sort of collaboration that companies, and Workday, of course, has one, but it doesn't take away the creating of the space between people so that people feel safe to share their opinions in a face-to-face format if they want to. And I am a very strong advocate of that. You shouldn't be angry or upset if somebody has an opinion that is different from yours. You should be actually very welcoming to that. To Lauryn's point earlier, we all are made of different fibers and different colors and different, sort of tapestries of life. And I think that, that if we're not, we've got the ears open and the heart open to listen to different opinions, we're not going to progress. But conversely, organizations that have that, in their fabric of who they are as a company, are organizations that are performing. And quite frankly, they build better environments for people to, going back to where we started, to feel they belong more.
Yes. Thank you so much for that, Rogerio. Again, it's the experience, it's the environment. So, I don't think any of us would disagree that, it's important to have regular discussions. Listening is also critical. Blair, it's the same question, but maybe with a little bit of a twist, right? So yes, we should create atmospheres and environments where people feel listened to. Sometimes people aren't always ready to speak up, right? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so such an important topic, and the comments about feedback loops by Rogerio and Lauryn are so important for organizations to realize. And let me just put in a one for free here, as they say, which is what we're talking about is not a nice to do. People say, well, maybe I can do this in my organization, maybe I don't have to. No, these steps are mandatory right now. The 21st century workforce is demanding that organizations focus more on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is what we're talking about primarily today, although the topics are closely related. And if you choose not to, if you say, our leadership team's not going to be focused on this, our organization's not going to be focused on this, you can bet, and we're seeing this all across the market, across almost every single industry, that the workforce is making choices predicated upon what organizations are doing around precisely the topics that we're talking about. So you run the risk of not being able to effectively recruit, and you run the risk of not being able to effectively retain. In addition to all, so that's the downside, right? If you choose not to do it, but there's tremendous upside, right? If you do choose to create these kinds of environments. I mean, I talked about cash flow. It turns out that organizations that create an inclusive environment and focus on diversity, equity, inclusion are 6 times more innovative than organizations that don't. Right? That's a real business impact. It turns out that they're 41% more likely to have higher market share than their competitors. I mean, these are statistics that are on the positive side. So there's a downside for not doing this, and there's an upside for doing it, right? And that's super important. So to your question, not everybody's ready. And what I would say is, we've been through a very tumultuous period over the last 2 years in this country. And in that, there's a couple of thoughts for people that I want to throw out to leaders who may be listening and saying, what can I do? How do I approach this? And are there people who are, in fact, in different places with their ability to be able to engage me in these conversations? The first point is just relationships matter. I mean, you've talked about this as human-centered, Tracy. That is spot on. And that's something we talk about a lot at Accenture. Human-centered. How do we bring this back down to the level of humanity? Relationships are more important than ever before. So what does that mean? Relationships are very hard to form in the middle of a crisis. So when you're in crisis, it's hard for me to form trusted relationships, which says, like, how do we start thinking about forming those relationships before the next crisis, right? So that we can have that interchange and exchange of ideas and passions and tap into that innovation, right? So somebody may say, I missed it for this crisis of COVID and George Floyd, et cetera, but start forming those relationships now so that you have that ability before the next one hits, because it's very hard to form in the middle of a crisis. And then even more directly to your point, understand that in the midst of a crisis, people are not affected the same way, right? Some people are disproportionately affected. Now, I'll put myself out there as an African American, and I will say, the George Floyd crisis hit me in the gut. It wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was something that my family, my friends, I've had similar experiences. I personally have had similar experiences with respect to exchanges with law enforcement. Now, I'm not anti-law enforcement at all, but there's been some big issues that the African American community has grappled with. And I'm talking about from the layperson all the way up to the CEO of an organization that has grappled with police for a long time, right? So there was a tremendous amount of emotion that was released when those incidents hit. Now, what does that mean? That means that quite often, if you want to talk to me about that, you have to be sensitive to the journey that I'm on, right? Similar with the Asian population in the aftermath of COVID, went through a similar kind of thing where there was a tremendous amount of pressure and negative energy that pumped through that community, where Asian Americans were in a very defensive position, many of them, because they were going through that incredible amount of emotion every single day. Now, what that means for somebody who's trying to establish a relationship with me is it's hard in that moment for somebody who I don't know, don't trust, don't have a relationship with me to come up to me and say, what's it like to be a Black man in America right now? I'm not ready to have that conversation unless we have a trusted relationship that has been predicated and built upon a lot of different exchanges. What might they do instead? They might just say, Blair, how are you doing? How are you doing? I remember a conversation I had with a veteran many years ago. And quite frankly, I didn't have a whole lot of experience talking to veterans. And I said, you just came back from a tour overseas in Afghanistan. You've been through all of this incredible tumult. What do I say to you? Like, what do I say? I'm sorry. I was asking the most basic question. What do I say? And that's what we're talking about here. We're getting down to brass tacks. And he looked me in the eye and he said, just ask me how I'm doing. Like, you don't have to ask me what was it like to, be overseas in the middle of a firefight, and how did you feel when you had to take human life? I mean, I'm not ready to have that conversation with you. But if you just ask me how I'm doing, like, that would be so appreciated. And that would be the start of a relationship, right? Yes. And then check back in with me and make it genuine and authentic, as we've talked about here. And recognize I may not be ready to go to that next stage with you because I don't know you yet. We don't have that basis established. And if we can understand that, right, and just try to make those connections, not just because it's the right thing to do, although it is, but because there's a business imperative for us to do it as leaders. I think we'll begin to tap into the power of what we're talking about.
Clearly, we're going to have a follow-up conversation with this group because this is just such rich discussion. So I want to thank all of you for such a meaningful conversation. Your insights have been invaluable. But what I also love are the practical things that we can all do today to be the change. I also want to thank those of you who tuned in today. And I'd like to leave us with one of my favorite quotes from the late, great Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. It's simple. So I invite all of us to do better for ourselves, for one another, and ultimately for the greater good. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's Workday Chats, and be well.